The biggest question, of course, is the one you just alluded to. What are the actual goals that President Trump is committed to and that he says the campaign will be sustained until they're achieved? Because he said some very different things along the way. He said this was a war to produce a change in the regime by weakening it so that the Iranian people could then rise up and take over the government. He spoke about the nuclear program, of course. He's spoken about the threat of the ballistic missiles. He's also said it could go on for 4 weeks, but it could end in 2 days, and that he might be unwilling to talk to the regime, and then that he will be willing to talk to the regime. So there's a very confused and inconsistent presentation of the case and the strategy for this war, and that, I think, produces a lot of uncertainty. Now, of course, a second question is how much fight do the Iranians have in them? At the moment, they are suffering severe blows dealt to them by the U.S. and the Israeli military, including, of course, wiping out their top leadership, including the supreme leader. They are still, however, able to get ballistic missiles fired. I'm speaking to you from Tel Aviv. And there have been, yet again this morning, sirens as missiles have been fired from Iran toward Israel. Hezbollah has now joined. And so if Iran has weeks of fight in it, that they continue to get these missiles launched, this could go on for quite some time.
Well, you also, under President Biden, were a liaison to Israel on Iran, so you know Ali Larijani pretty well. Can he hold the loyalty of the IRGC? And also, what is his intention here? He's just posted on X in the last hour that he will not negotiate with the United States.
He's a creature of the Iranian system, about as establishment a person as there is in the Iranian in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Close to the IRGC, he was close to the supreme leader. It would not surprise me if at some point he is willing to re-enter negotiations. Obviously, part of the regime that previously did conduct negotiations. If they do so now, though, it would be as part of a regime survival strategy. Now, that will pose a dilemma for President Trump, who days before the war began said he would have foregone this conflict if he had gotten the concessions he was seeking on the nuclear program. Maybe that would still be his position. But having started the war, having said it's for changing the regime, having called on the Iranian people to come out and take over, and this is their moment of freedom, it would be inconsistent for him to then take that deal that maybe now Larijani is willing to offer when they weren't willing to offer those concessions before the war began.
I mean, Larijani has said in the past that if Iran were to be attacked by the US or Israel, that it would have no choice but to develop a nuclear weapon. What are the odds that instead of backing down, Larijani and all associated with the leadership goes all in on this, and if they don't have the military capacity, they find other ways to fight back, Dan?
That's always been the risk of this kind of a conflict, is that you know how it starts, but you don't really know how it ends. There certainly could be scenarios in which an even more hardline regime takes hold in Iran, one that is not willing to observe actually the limits that Khamenei put on the nuclear program, much as close as they were before last June to achieving a nuclear weapon. He had never given the order to produce one. Maybe a different leadership would decide that now, for their own survival, they must have that deterrent. However, knowing what the U.S. military was capable of last June when it destroyed underground facilities, and probably would have to take into account to destroy similar facilities if they saw Iran making that move, I think that would be a very risky decision by any Iranian leaders, and they might themselves be at risk, given what Israel has demonstrated in its precision targeting of individuals. But these are scenarios that could have this war spinning out over weeks rather than over days. That is something that obviously people watching the markets are going to be very concerned about. If it's something that is contained and there's a quick resolution or a quick surrender or a quick deal, then some of these instability-producing events can be contained. But we've already seen 11 countries in the region be struck by Iranian missiles. This is spreading. It's not being contained.
Dan, are the lifting of sanctions and various other sort of sweeteners, are they just off the table now? Is that just not going to happen?
It's among the reasons I had no expectation that a nuclear deal was possible before the war began, because first Iran wasn't willing to make the necessary concessions of no enrichment and shipping out all of their highly enriched materials. But even if they were, after that regime had slaughtered 10, 20, 30,000 of its own people who were out protesting for freedom, there's no validity, no political viability to provide the sanctions relief that they would have demanded. So this regime is so tarnished that it's almost impossible politically to imagine the U.S. Congress and various other actors agreeing to give it an economic lifeline while it still survives. So if it manages to survive this war, it's going to do so with the Iranian economy crushed even further than it was going in. Only an end of this regime creates a possible opening to that, but there's no clear strategy or clear path that produces that goal. And there's even indications from President Trump, depending on which reporter he's talking to, that maybe he'll cut a deal within 2 or 3 days, stopping the fighting, leaving this very weakened regime in power.
Just very, very, very briefly, because we're out of time, Dan, what's your read on whether President Trump will have any say at all on leadership in Iran, like he might have done in Venezuela?
I don't see a Delcy Rodriguez-style figure emerging from the Iranian regime. I don't think that system lends itself to it. The country is very different than Venezuela. The ideology is very, very deep. So this regime falls and is replaced by a different regime, maybe a very chaotic situation, or it will remain a very hostile regime to the United States, dangerous, even if very much weakened.